Wonderful. Thanks, everyone joining us this morning. Thanks to those of you in the room. Thanks to those of you online. If you haven't noticed, the camera is streaming live to the internet, so do be aware that whatever you say will live on forever on YouTube. So speak with due caution. For those of you who don't know, I'm Abhi Bhattacharya. I'm Interim Director here at the Social Market Foundation, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you here today to be able to talk about an issue that's been exercising us quite a bit over the last few months. As a think tank, what you're really looking for a lot of the time is to look for an issue that kind of captures a reality that people were kind of maybe dimly aware of, that a problem that was kind of inchoate but hadn't really been given an expression. If you can start to measure it, if you can start to point to where the problem lies, and if you start to think about solutions, that's really striking gold for a think tank. And I think we've been really taken aback by the response we've had to the work we've done around transport poverty, the interest that's garnered, the real kind of level of engagement. So I mean, I'll let my colleague Gideon, who's been leading the work, talk about that in a moment. But I think it was something that we were conscious was a latent issue, but I don't think we were quite appreciative what we've released and what we've hopefully kicked off a good discussion and debate about. Particularly salient this week as we sit here a week before the budget, and there's going to be a big debate around fuel duty in particular, but also questions about public investment in public services, including transport. So I'm really delighted to have a fantastic panel here to discuss the topic of transport poverty, the work we've done, and broader issues around it. So the kind of format for the event will be my colleague Gideon Slutin, who is a research hub here at the Social Market Foundation, who's led our work on transport poverty. We'll give you a kind of quick rundown of the work we've done. We're then going to have a contribution from Caroline Strickland from Transport for All, which is a disabled-led group campaigning for free, dignified, and easy access to transport. We've got Jonathan Gibson on the right here, who's Head of Policy and Public Affairs at West Midlands Combined Authority. And as Gideon will say, this is a very regionally kind of dispersed issue, so it'll be fascinating to get a sense of the kind of dynamics around that from a devolution perspective. And on the left, we've got Leonie Cooper here, who is London Assembly member for Merton and Wandsworth, Deputy Leader of the Labour Group and Environmental Lead for Labour, to reflect on the London perspective and maybe a bit of a Labour party political perspective as well. But we'll start with Gideon, and so if you just give us a bit of an overview as to what you've done, what you found, and maybe some of the response as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to start off, we decided to, when we started talking about poverty, transport poverty, it was immediately a hot button issue on how to define it. A lot of definitions, we opted exclusively for affordability. It doesn't talk about the accessibility and mobility of different transport options. We wanted to see how many people were pushed into poverty by transport costs. Put another way, how many people would not be in poverty were it not for transport costs. When we tallied that up, we found about 5 million people across the UK pushed into poverty by transport. Geographically, in terms of regions, they're pretty much where you would expect. Less so in London, more so in the north, in the Midlands, as well as Wales and Scotland. Although even when you look at cities like London, London has the lowest regionally, but it really depends on at a lower level from there. So if you look where we are, transport poverty is going to be near zero, given easy access to public transport. That said, if you look over in Barking, transport poverty is around 20%. When we looked at who was responsible for this, what elements, motoring was overwhelmingly the culprit. So households spend about £5,000 or £6,000 a year on transport. Motoring is responsible for 97% of those costs. That's partly just because people tend to drive more, but it's also because motoring is the most expensive way to get around, probably short of planes. The average cost of a driving trip is around £6. That's compared to something like 2.4 on a bus. Obviously, that means if you are a household that has to drive more, you're going to be spending more. Rural households are spending about £9,000 a year on transport. That's not our numbers, that's ONS data, although our numbers corroborate it. Which also finds that it's the highest expense for rural households short of mortgage costs. One thing that I was surprised by throughout the research is that despite all of these costs, it's really, really not discussed. We discuss the affordability of other stuff like food and fuel and energy, but somehow with transport, the costs are never that much of an element in the discussion. We talk about the amount of taxes we spend on it, and the other element we talk about is fuel duty, which would be preference. So next week, we're likely to see another fuel duty freeze and possibly a cut, which has been ongoing since 2010. This has frozen the rate of fuel duty at lower than it would be otherwise, but has done almost nothing for transport poverty. So one of the things we wanted to look at is how well we're spending on money when it comes to reducing transport poverty. And all of these cuts combined have cost the UK about 130 billion up till now since 2010. That's going to rise to 200 billion by 2030, yet has done almost nothing to reduce transport poverty. It saves the average household about £13 a month, and it's just because fuel duty is a pretty minor factor in the driver's overall cost. It takes up about 17% of the driver's costs. So if we're reducing fuel duty marginally in such a marginal amount, you can see that the overall costs are minimal that you're saving. And yet it's the main thing we talk about when we're talking about transport poverty. To the extent that we talk about it at all, it's only referenced in the budget as an element of fuel duty when they reference how press drivers, white van man, and how fuel duty is going to save them. So the other element of the report that I wanted to bring up is the alternatives that we have that we suggested. The first one is public transport. I've referenced that a couple of times already. But public transport is the simplest, easiest way to decrease transport poverty. It's cheaper, as I mentioned, bus trips are cheaper. Rail is also cheaper when you're looking at long distances. What we saw was that every 10% increase in public transport speeds that allows people to start taking public transport rather than cars, would save the average household £435 a year. You can compare that to fuel duty numbers, and yet the amount of billions we're funneling to fuel duty just is doing nothing. London, I would also add, is sort of living proof of that. London has the lowest transport poverty, half the average spend on transport, and the best public transport in the country. 28% of trips are on public transport over here compared to 8%, I think is the English average. And that's not going to work everywhere, of course. You know, a rural village can't get the same public transport speeds that London is going to have, but it could easily be applied in different cities. And if you apply it to every city, you can drop poverty by 22% in those towns. The other element, and this is my last one, so sorry for all the big scary numbers, is EVs. EVs can save drivers between £6,000 and £10,000 over the course of that vehicle's lifetime. They're cheaper to drive, cheaper to fuel, cheaper to service. That said, they're still extremely expensive in terms of the upfront cost. You're not going to start seeing price parity until around 2030, is what most economists expect. But at that time, you could see massive, massive cuts in transport poverty just by the savings that people can get from EVs. Again, like public transport, that doesn't apply to everyone, but it could manage to decrease poverty in general by around 4 or 6%. Happy to go into more detail on any of this stuff, but that's sort of the general overview of the findings that we got.
Thanks so much, Vivian. Right, next I'm going to turn to Caroline Strickland from Tracker for All.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at Social Market Foundation and to be talking about both the findings of your great new report, but also how they apply to the community that I am from and I work with every day, which is the disabled community. And we are about 16 million people across the UK. And it was really good to hear in the report how the intersections of transport poverty and disability come together, because I think when we're thinking about people who are disabled, we're not a homogenous group, and I think when we're thinking about people living in transport poverty, really important to recognise it's not a homogenous group as well, and those intersections are really important so that we can think about solutions that work for everyone living in transport poverty. So Transport for All, we use something called the social model of disability, which means we are working to address access barriers, which are socially constructed or designed barriers that can prevent us from accessing transport. So the obvious ones, infrastructure, step-free access, lack of lifts. But we talk a lot about financial barriers, and that's what I wanted to touch upon today. The reason that we exist is because disabled people make 38% fewer journeys every year than non-disabled people. So there's a lot of untapped journeys. And the Motability Foundation have found that closing that transport gap would bring in 72.4 billion to the economy annually. So big numbers, again, just to jump on Gideon's throwing some scary numbers around to start with. So as I said, I'm going to speak briefly about disabled people and transport poverty, but I just wanted to underline that point that we need to address transport poverty for everyone, including disabled people. So why are disabled people more likely to live in transport poverty? We're twice as likely to be unemployed, and we're 12 percentage points more likely than non-disabled people to live in poverty. Scope, who are a great disability charity, found that our extra costs every month are £985 more than non-disabled families. So we've got this extra cost that we're living with anyway. And transport costs are the second most extra cost for disabled people after energy. So it's really important, and totally take Gideon's point that we may be not talking about this enough, but some of us are, disabled people have been shouting about this for a long time, so it's great to hear everyone else kind of catching up. So why are we more likely to be in poverty? So our transport needs can cost more. Really interesting hearing about the impact of motoring and reliance on a car. For disabled people, we can't access our local train station if it's not step-free, or our local bus service is so unreliable, we can't get to the appointments we need to get to on time. We're more likely to rely on a car. And our cars are super expensive. You need to get adaptations, you need a hoist, you need to control it with your feet, not your hands, for example. Those adaptations cost an awful lot. And it's really interesting to note the savings that can come from electric vehicles, but these are really hard to adapt because of the way that they're designed and built. The engine is in a different place, so just putting a hoist in or putting a seat that comes out in is much, much harder in an EV. So I'm really interested to think about how we can future-proof transport to make it more accessible to those that are more likely to be in transport poverty. And if we're building electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's not accessible, we're just going to be locking out a huge number of people from these more cost-effective solutions. I could talk about this all day, but I'll try and be brief. So what's the impact of transport poverty on disabled people? So 18% of people who responded to a survey that we published last year, which is called Are We There Yet?, told us that public transport access had curtailed their chance to be in employment. Now, we know that being in employment doesn't stop you being in poverty. I'm not suggesting that, but that is a really significant number of people who are being locked out of good quality employment because of inaccessible transport. And I've already said about the value of closing that transport gap, which is 72.4 billion return to the economy each year. So what needs to change? Completely agree with the finding in the report about a credible public transport investment plan. We want that investment to be done in a way that actually reflects the reality of transport for disabled people. So at the moment, our friends at the Levelling Up department are using a metric for transport accessibility, which basically tracks what's the average journey time to a local place of employment or local hub. And it doesn't look at whether that journey is accessible. So does it use a step-free station? Does it use a bus stop that has a seating area for someone who can't stand for too long away from the bus? So until we're measuring transport accessibility and availability in a way that reflects everyone's experiences, including disabled people, people living in transport poverty, we're not going to be making good investment decisions. We're going to be proliferating, perpetuating even, these paths that we're going through this path dependency of just doing more of the same rather than looking at what the reality is that comes to work there. So we want more transparent investment, we want better metrics, and we also want better financial support. So how can we move people from reliance on the car to public transport? It needs to be accessible, but it needs to be affordable. So yes, London is really good, but I have a freedom pass, I'm a disabled person, and this morning to get here on time, I had to pay for my travel because you can't use a freedom pass in London before 9:30. So what assumptions are we making about the people who are accessing transport concessions which might be making it more costly to make the journeys we need to make. I will pause there, but really looking forward to continuing the conversation this morning.
Brilliant. Thanks, Caroline. Now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan Gibson from West Midlands Combined Authority.
Thank you very much, and for the invitation you give to the report and the contribution of picking up on some of those themes. So the West Midlands Combined Authority, we represent around 2.9 million people. We are the second largest city region after here in London. Part of the role of the Combined Authority is number of modes of public transport provision. We don't run the buses, but funding for buses flows through us. I think we invest in the region of over £700 million projected in the next financial year into transport, capital and revenue schemes. It is a particularly relevant matter for our general remit, which is to promote the economic development of the region. We are 3 cities and 4 towns and 4 areas. They are very geographically dispersed. We don't have a monocentric urban model like you may see in Manchester and London. The connectivity of places and how they can access economic opportunities is really important, and it's part of our mission. We see around 25% of people in the region who don't have a car, and the majority of public transport users use the bus. And as I say, the main challenge we saw over the last few years as a result of COVID is how the costs of transport in the region impacted people's experiences, particularly of the economy, but also of leisure, and they were pushed towards greater use of walking, and ultimately they were spending less resource in the economy. So the impacts of transport and the people's individual financial positions really reared its head in beyond the transport space and impacted their experience of the place and their individual well-being. So as a combined authority, we are very alive to these challenges and some of the issues you have raised. We have seen commitments related to transport devolution in all 3 of the devolution deals we've signed and negotiated since 2015. The first one being a commitment to an integrated public transport fund. But the Trailblazer deal we negotiated with government last year, which was announced at the budget, included a number of additional and more detailed commitments on, for example, how you could integrate different modes of transport, as we see in London and are starting to see in Greater Manchester with the B network, and we are pioneering a similar approach in here. But I think the benefit of a devolution deal from a transport poverty and inclusion point of view is that it does provide local places and leaders with a platform to say, here are the particular drivers of transport inaccessibility in my area. So we saw in our deal an interest in government in speaking to us about how, for example, public safety on the bus network could be explored and addressed. That is a well-being and a safety issue, but it is also an economic issue if people aren't able to go and to work for one or another reason. So again, the platform that the deal provides us, I know to colleagues in Greater Manchester as well, allow us to say, issues that may slightly beyond the purview of Whitehall, but that we really see because, our political decision makers are 7 council leaders in the mayor, they are intimately connected to their place, and that allowed us to have that particular conversation. I think as we've touched on, we are the Regional Transport Authority, but there are some levers slightly beyond our control. We don't raise particular transport taxes or levies, for example, directly to the Combined Authority. We are very grants dependent to receive most of the 700 million of funding we are investing next year largely comes from central government grants. There is a significant share that we raise directly from local authorities through the transport levy. But I think what we are really excited and optimistic about is how the single settlement of funding that we hope to secure from government will provide us with a lot more flexibility over the types of interventions we can pursue. As I mentioned, our transport network is very bus heavy. We have a limited metro network at present. We have a very heavy train network. The kind of urban structure of the region points you towards a particular model. That looks very different in London. It looks very different in Manchester. It looks very different in West Yorkshire. So how we can use the single settlements to say what are the interventions the region needs? How can we integrate accessibility considerations into that? A positive step forward. And I would say DFT and DLUC and Treasury colleagues have been certainly on that journey with us, and we're making good progress. So that will hopefully allow us to say, how can we listen to what communities and places need and help support that with more. The last point I would make is that in the UK, we are a very fiscally centralised country. We see another particular cities, states like Berlin, for example, they receive a lot of their funding from direct taxation that they receive, and their public transport system is funded to the tune of some 50 to 60% of the overall fare box. So that kind of ability for you to go above and beyond the kind of constraints of the commercial operating model, it is really helpful where you are sufficiently funded as a transport authority. And they mentioned the greater flexibility over the funding we do receive is a really positive step forward, but that's not to ignore the quantum we receive as well. I think that the introduction, for example, of the £2 fare cap was a really positive step by government and has helped us a lot. But we are dependent on that partnership with the government to make sure we're properly resourced and have the right flexibilities to reflect some of these considerations of the policies and schemes we run.
Fantastic, thank you, Jonathan. Now I'm going to hand over to Leonie for the London and the Labour perspective.
Well, I actually want to just say something about the out of London experience, because we all came here using London transport. Some of us will have stood at a bus stop and seen an indicator that said the bus was going to be 3 minutes. I mean, how appalling is that? We might have stood on a tube station platform and it might have said that the train was going to be 3 minutes. 3 minutes, the whole 3 minutes of my life lost to waiting. Of course, that's what Londoners do. That's what we look at these indicators and we say 3 minutes, 5 minutes. That's an outrage. I sometimes have to get the DLR and it says 8 minutes. I've not lived outside London for a long time, but I have worked outside London, and I work for a very large housing association across the West Midlands, the East Midlands and East Anglia. And I was the sustainability manager. And what I was trying to do was to move the organisation to be more sustainable across absolutely all parts of its business, including the way that the staff got out to go and visit people in the houses across East Anglia and the East Midlands. The West Midlands was a lot easier because there is better public transport there. Sorry. And it was impossible, absolutely impossible, to get people away from having cars provided either by the organisation as company cars or providing their own vehicles. Because if you sent the staff to the office in various parts of Norfolk and Suffolk, 3 days for a bus to come, which would mean that you would track them in that office and they would be able to get there, and then they wouldn't be able to go and visit anybody unless you put bicycles in the office, which actually we did. And that worked very well because Norfolk and Suffolk are quite flat. But the situation was very, very bad. And the only way that we are truly going to be able to tackle transport poverty is to make sure that areas where people are trapped into car usage outside of London in many areas, you just cannot get around adequately. And the same is also true in London. London is 32 boroughs in the city of London. It isn't one sort of monolith, and actually getting across London can take hours, literally hours. If you go from one end of the Northern Line to my end of the Northern Line, that is a really, really, really lengthy journey. And it might also be inaccessible in various parts as well. So what do we need to do when we're making policy, and also when we've got the possibility of changing things? Now, in 2016, there was a change in mayor. That's nearly 8 years ago now. And I came into City Hall at that point with Sadiq Khan as the mayor. And over the next couple of years, developed, working alongside the mayor, it's something the Assembly does, London Environment Strategy, which had some very strong indicators towards improving London's air, cleaning up air quality, but also the Mayor's Transport Strategy. And I think these overarching documents are really, really important because they set out the direction of travel. I know we were talking about going on a journey earlier as well, so it's very difficult to have a discussion about transport without using some of these analogies. But it's really important to have that direction of travel because you cannot fix the problems that we have just by government trying to do something, regional government trying to do something, or local government. It has to be something where you carry people with you and you make the possibility that they can change how they want to conduct their journeys, but also you need to bring the private sector as well as the public sector, because that is the way, and unless you're going to completely, renationalise all of the bus services and all of the trains. And I can't see any incoming government after the next general election, what will be the price tag of that? So I don't think that's going to happen. So we have to take people with us. And the watchword in the transport strategy was that 80% of all journeys would be done by active travel or by public transport by 2041. Now, I might argue about whether 2041 is not early enough, but that is an overarching target that is there behind a number of the initiatives that have then flown from it. And one of the really important issues that we need to do is to persuade people from seeking the individual solution, which is what the private car is, to being prepared to accept the joint solution, which is what public transport is. Now, I started by talking about waiting 3 minutes for a tube train. I have never owned a tube train. I don't think anyone in the room has either. I have also never owned a bus. They're quite expensive. I'm unlikely to ever buy them. But lots of people still feel very committed to the idea of owning their own car. And we do need to move people away from that as a concept. And we need to start viewing this as shared mobility for health reasons. The active travel also has the health benefits, but it also helps to clean up the air. Obviously, if you start to move away from the diesel and the petrol engine. But even so, even if we have the push towards electric vehicles, the individual ownership of vehicles. So we need to see this as the overarching push towards shared mobility. Whether that's shared mobility in a taxi that you jump into for 5 minutes for a ride from here to there, whether it's a leased vehicle that you might have for a few days, whether you're joining a car club and you have access to cars that are being refreshed by the club. And I think that's a piece that has been missing from the mayoral transport strategy. We've had a really good focus on cleaning up the taxi fleet. So we've had sunset clauses, and if you're going to get a new taxi, it's got to be zero emission capable while you're using it in central London. We've been installing bike lanes galore, much to the annoyance of some of the taxi drivers, I have to say. We've also, has anybody not heard about ULEZ and the ultra low emission zone, and that's been expanded to cover the whole of London? I've just about mentioned that in case you haven't heard. So all of these are all essential. But behind the transport strategy and the environment strategy, we also have the London plan to make it easier, make it more difficult in some cases for people to find parking for cars, but to make it really easy to get the electric vehicle charging points, the disabled parking places. By the way, of course, the mayoral transport strategy is 80% of journeys, and that it takes complete recognition that there are some people who, because of their specific needs, will not be able to use public transport, even however accessible you try and make it. But and also forcing people to put in more bicycle parking. So we are moving forward on all of these, and I think it's absolutely essential that all authorities, and we do need government action to deal with the other thing that is now starting to proliferate all over the now a fire from a bad conversion every 2 days in London that's having to be dealt with. So I think the big thing for me is about shared mobility, and that is a really, really key driver towards reducing costs. But if you don't make it accessible to people, they are not going to go in that direction. They will carry on seeking their own individualised transport solutions, and we still have so much more to do. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm probably going to ask a few questions of the panel for the next 10-15 minutes, and then throw over to yourselves in the audience and yourselves online. So do sharpen your own questions. I'm sure there's lots there for you all to chew on. So I'll start by taking a bit of a step back and pick up the thread that you laid for us. So you talked about transport potentially being transport poverty being something of a neglected issue, and trying and push back a wee bit on that. Where do you think we are in terms of the kind of the politics and the discourse and the framing of the issue of transport and how it relates to poverty. Do people agree with Gideon's kind of the way he presented it? And what do we get right and what do we get wrong in the way that we think about the problem? Who wants to come in first?
I can get first, correct.
Sure.
Yeah, I should be more careful when we talk about that. I would say that I think in terms of the central government, in terms of MPs, SPADs, and ministers, that they tend to be behind the people I speak to in local authorities and the polling that we see in general, where it seems to be one of those classic cases where politicians are behind the times and nervous about the potential of, say, raising taxes to bring in fresh transport, putting more money into buses, into active travel. Whereas if you look at the opinion polling, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we seem to see way more support for spending money on services rather than continuing to cut. And yet over the last 10 years, 15 years, I think 80% of bus lines have been cut in some areas, average of 50% across the country. So I think there's a difference between talking about central government and talking about the public when we say we're behind the times, behind the opportunity.
Yes, in terms of how the debate is framed, how the discourse kind of.
I think just to come in, I think some of the debate, I absolutely agree with what you were saying earlier about shared mobility. But I think some of the debate in terms of looking at solutions to transport poverty being about moving it out of cars and moving it towards shared mobility, I think can be a little bit kind of culture warrior maybe, and we see disabled people and many other people with protected characteristics often being co-opted into these debates. And I think the whole debate could be really improved by actually talking to the communities who are in these situations, which I think the report really, starts to do, to really shine a light on what are the barriers that are holding us back from making that modal shift. And I think, making it more about people than the policies is always a good place to start.
So what do you think the kind of misconceptions are from people who claim to make assumptions or talk on your behalf?
I think it's, so perhaps think about people who rely on a car as either selfish because we're polluting the environment and we don't, whatever, we're not interested in the climate crisis, or lazy, people with non-visible impairments like yourself, perhaps using a car, using a taxi, and there's just not being an understanding of why that choice is being made, or that it's not a choice, that other option isn't there because it's not acceptable, because the pavement is blocked by people parking on the pavement, so we can't get to the bus stop or what have you. And I think, trying to bring it back to the reality of transport, which is why I was talking so much about needing metrics and measurements that reflect the reality, rather than being kind of imposed from a kind of top level down to people whose lives are very different to that kind of metric way of measuring it.
We do have a metric actually for your access to public transport, which is called PTAL, the Public Transport Access Level. And obviously people who have a very low PTAL, they are probably a long way from public transport. But we still don't include that within it, that some of the shared mobility that I was referring to. And that's where I think we really do need to move faster so that those people, we're just doing some consultation where I live on should we put in some bays for e-scooters and e-bikes so that people using them, who can use them, should put them in a particular place rather than just leaving them in the middle of the pavement so that anybody with a buggy or who's in a wheelchair or who is visually impaired just walks straight into them. And I had a lot of people responding to me saying, well, actually, I use it to get from the station to my house. So I really want to park it near my house because I'm a woman and I'm afraid. So it also addresses safety issues for me. And I think it's the whole piece around convenience and making it convenient for people. And if we can bring in some of that element, but at the same time, we can't sort of continue to have the Wild West of no legislation so that, not exploding batteries all over. The lithium ion exploding batteries is just, that is just awful. We need to sort that out, but then sorting out, sort of saying that actually your PTAR's improved because a car club has come into your area and when you need to use a car. And I think putting all of those in, you then take away from this discussion of saying you shouldn't be using that form of transport. I don't really mind what form of transport it is. If it's shared mobility, it will be cheaper, it will be better for the environment. And I think we need to be much less judgmental about, you know, oh, you must do everything on a bicycle. No, not everybody wants to ride a bicycle or can ride a bicycle.
I think in terms of the central government narrative and the political narrative, I think on the former, I would say the genesis of the levelling up agenda sought to say, if you are only thinking about where can I invest and spend money in such a way that it gets the highest return on investment, then I think that does lead you to a situation where, which you referenced in the report, there is a fertile ground for them to breed and take hold. And I do think over in the last 4 years, we've seen them move away from that. All reforms within the Green Book seek to say, how can we reflect the strategic case? How can we consider well-being as part of the business case that was a few years before that still? So I guess I think if you are thinking about, you know, the transport network in most regions is very challenging to maintain, you know, particularly after COVID, where our bus passenger levels are at around 90% of where they were pre-COVID. So, you know, the revenue situation is challenging. I think the need to maintain that focus, and, you know, let's not just think about this BCR and benefit to cost ratios and only invest where we are getting the biggest return. I think that is an important factor of how central government can say to places, okay, we are going to think about more considerations in that. And then I think if you do accept that, the principle of what matters for places being quite different is really important too. So, you know, if you allow a place to invest in cycle infrastructure, I think it is really important for areas to be able to have flexibility over where those lanes go. I think over the past few years there has been kind of encroachments into the principle of local flexibility on such matters and bus stops, for example. So having the national policy framework acknowledging the need to go slightly beyond the BCR and provide the local flexibility about what happens on the ground is really important. But I'd say from a combined authorities point of view, so we aren't just responsible for transport, we're responsible for, you know, over £200 million of adult skills funding, you know, close to £100 million of housing and region funding, retrofit funding, and some business support funding as well. You know, we have that kind of broader rebate. And what we see that when you think about place and the ability of places to integrate things, you know, we do spend some of our adult skills funding, for example, on public transport, because it's an enabler of people to access skills. How you develop your urban environments is a reduction in the need for people to travel. You know, in some parts of our region, we don't build very densely, which means that although we, for example, think as a centre of a city says we have to have a broader public transport and the geography than somewhere like Munich, but there are fewer people within the 45-minute radius because buildings aren't as dense. So if you think about levers beyond public transport and the role of place and being able to bring them together, I think you can start to look slightly beyond revenue transport domain and ultimately capture some of these benefits in those schemes, you know, because everything we've been talking about matters for productivity, it matters for education, it matters for health. But if you're just thinking about this solely from a transport lens, you don't capture those spillover benefits, then you aren't really appreciating the full impact of accessible transport. Or, for example, let's say we can help to provide that different multifaceted view on it, but and we're getting there by way of the enabling environment to enable us to do so.
Well, I want to give everyone kind of ample opportunity for questions. Are there any questions from the floor or from the line? Yes, yourself.
Just a quick question. I was intrigued in the idea that electric cars are difficult to adapt for disabled people. Has anyone had a conversation with the manufacturers? Because I would think that it would be relatively easy to also design a car and to accommodate them.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's endemic, unfortunately, to a lot of kind of future mobility in that oftentimes it's sort of moving quite fast to develop new ways of transport. So it could be EVs, we could be talking about e-scooters, we could be talking about mobility as a service platforms like Journey Plan. That unfortunately at the moment accessibility still seems to come through as a bit of a afterthought or a cherry on the cake. And one of the things we're really pushing for at Transport for All is for accessibility to be prioritised up there with both safety and sustainability. And I think based on today, affordability should be up there as well. And saying, you know, transport won't be affordable until it's accessible, or it won't be sustainable until it's accessible. And we really want to see a sort of culture shift in the industry, whether it's EVs or elsewhere, that you start with the user needs, and those user needs shouldn't be, with apologies to some colleagues on the panel, of the white man. Those user needs should be intersectional and should reflect all of your potential customer base. And I think once the industry start talking to disabled people and disabled people's organisations like mine, and starting that before they've made their minds up, then we'll see less and less of this baking in access barriers into things like EVs and into the charging infrastructure as well. It's the same problem. So yes, I'm equally as surprised, or maybe not surprised, equally as annoyed by it as you, but maybe less surprised that it has to go.
Other questions? Yes, so they're back.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for a really interesting discussion. I work at the Centre for Education and Youth, and at the moment we're thinking about the links between transport poverty, school attendance, and children's access to cultural enrichment activities. I'd really love to hear any thoughts that you have on the way transport poverty specifically affects children and what solutions you'd like to see.
Good evening, members.
I can share the email that's in there.
We've done some good things in London. I mean, it is annoying that because of the pandemic and because of the deal over money for TfL, that the Freedom Pass had to be recalibrated to only start from 9:30 for people with disabilities and over 60s. However, there has been, I think using the Zip card for younger people, and I think the most recent announcement saying that young people living care will have, free travel is a really good thing. And I think this whole thing about free travel for many people, it's that persuasion, isn't it, to use public transport. And that is sometimes the thing that you really need to do is persuade people. So obviously, if you're then persuading young people to start with public transport, I think you're in a good place. So I think any incentives that can be given to persuade people, and I think there's, replicating things like the Zip card for use and the free travel for care leavers, I think expanding both of those as much as possible, because in the future that then pays off in terms of health and well-being, and also addresses the issues about affordability and hopefully convenience, because the more people use something, the more likely it is to be improved. I think there's this sort of tipping point, isn't there, with electric vehicles that we talk about, and there's been previous tipping points, and the more people use public transport, well, I think it's about 50% of Londoners now don't even have a car, so it's going down already. So I think the future is going to be that, and demographically, I think actually people under 30 are much less likely to own a car. So it's going in that direction where people don't feel the need to own their own vehicle. So I think that's a good thing to encourage them into the public transport.
Absolutely. I think things could be worse. That said, at the moment, in terms of what we're seeing right now, I didn't look specifically at data connecting to children and education. But one aspect that came up quite a lot throughout the local lit review and data was that it's not just the cost of travel that is a problem, but the reliability of it. So today, for example, there was a big delays on the Central and District line, which is one of the reasons we started late. If you are taking your kid to school, for instance, or trying to get to work after taking them to school, you are not going to be able to rely on a lot of these services, particularly in outer London and even more so in rural areas outside the country. And when you do opinion polling, and I've done opinion polling myself on this, but those I read says reliability is up there with affordability when people are deciding how to get around on transport. So suddenly you see this amplifier of all these existing inequalities, where if you are unable to access transport, public transport, alternative to cars, you are more likely to already be in poverty or close to it. You're unable to rely on any bus to decrease the cost. So all of a sudden you're spending more and able to spend less on extracurriculars, on schooling, on everything else. So one aspect that I think is a useful way to think about transport poverty is as an amplifier for existing inequality.
Not specifically answering the question, but I was just coming off what you just said in terms of, do you think that the the way that we're evaluating transport interventions then is not fit for purpose in terms of equality and impact assessment. So we don't look at poverty as not a protected characteristic, right? So how can colleagues like command authorities use those sorts of tools to protect against the negative impact on people living in hospital poverty?
So we've been having a lot of chats with local authorities about this exact topic. One aspect that I have learned in the course of the last few months is it is about as hard to change statistical processes as it is change policy. But yeah, at the moment, transport poverty is not discussed by DFT in the distribution of grants. Combined authorities are starting to look at transport poverty or different words for transport poverty. But yeah, at the moment, it's barely discussed. And that was sort of what I was referencing at the start when I said we don't really think about it in terms of cost, the way you do with everything else on energy and food. So yeah, I absolutely think we should be taking this into account. DFT should be accepting grant applications on the basis of the effect of transport poverty. At the moment, that is not happening, but we're hoping to push for that in the future.
It's actually something that we started to look at in a bit more detail as the decision was made to introduce the ultra low emission zone and expand it, which was made in November 22. And then during the whole of the course of 2023, a lot of discussions going on within City Hall about how do you target, the scrappage scheme, how do you target it? Can you target it towards specific groups of workers who are perhaps on low incomes but are very reliant on vehicles? So the obvious people are teaching assistants who may have big trouble because they can't afford to live anywhere near the school that they're working in, but also care assistants and people who are doing domiciliary care and going around to people's houses, where they're probably not being paid for the bits where they're travelling in between. They've just paid for the 15-minute care call. So obviously being able to do that on a bus is quite tricky. So quite a lot of them have got vehicles that obviously weren't going to comply with the requirements of ULEZ. So we've started to look into the details of that as we did all the design over all the sort of mitigations that were then offered, because the scrappage wasn't just money to scrap your car. There were about 2 dozen other things that you could apply for as well, including folding electric bikes and so on and so forth. So it is a really critical area, I think, because some people are very reliant on vehicles and are in very poorly paid employment, and also shift work when public transport just isn't completely unreliable because it doesn't exist, as it were.
John, very patient.
I mean, I wouldn't add very much more than to say, I think the issue you highlighted of the participation of young people in cultural enrichment activities is a big deal in the West Midlands, with the second highest regional unemployment rate for youth unemployment. It is partly a function of your transport provision. The lower skilled you are, the more localised your immediate labour market is compared to your high skills. You have a much broader labour market as per the statistics. So as well as the all issue we've talked about around transport provision and accessibility, etc., I'd say we kind of see that problem from the other end, which is where is your adult education provided from? We have a part of our employment skills strategies around inclusion, and community learning is a part of that. So again, it's part of transport gets you some of the way. There another day, I'm very sorry, but then also how you make sure education is accessible and close to people where provision is another route to thinking through that problem.
Got time for one more question from the floor, if anyone, or online, if anyone has any.
I want to just quickly come back to the distinction between individual use and joint use. Just wondering where you think schemes like social leasing for electric vehicles, for example, might fit into that paradigm. How that plays with public transport, for example, in a strategy to reduce transport poverty.
I can start off, yeah. Social leasing is sort of a way to bridge the two divides. It's a bit like the way co-op housing allows people to feel like homeowners but still benefit from social interventions. With social leasing, essentially the state subsidizes short-term leases of around 3 years for low-income individuals to buy an EV. France is doing it for less than €100 a month. It allows drivers to still feel like they own a car, still benefit from those individual aspects. Part of that is purely cultural. Part of it is real, tangible benefits of being able to drive yourself where you want to get. while still benefiting from state interventions. So I'm all in favor of it, and I think it is a good, maybe short-term way, but we need short-term ways to decrease poverty while improving on our decarbonization goals.
Anyone else have thoughts on social leasing? Right, we are coming towards the end of our session. So I just have kind of one kind of final wrap-up question. We are sitting here, by my calculation, 6 days from the budget, where there's been some big decisions on tax, on spending, which necessarily have impact on both the transport system and of course on poverty. So if you were face to face with Jeremy Hunt, what would you be counselling him to do to address the problem of transport poverty? Gideon, should we start with you and then we'll move along the.
Yeah, sure. I would go say to forget about fuel duty freezes, forget about fuel duty cuts, and to put that money into public transport grants.
Danny?
Since 2018, money does not come from the Department for Transport to London for the upkeep of roads. It's people who travel on buses and on the tube on public transport out of their fares. The roads have to be kept up. However, Londoners still pay vehicle excise duty. So my big plea would be to say, give us back all our £500 million per annum that we've been paying in vehicle excise duty and allow us to spend it on transport in London. And you can do the maths of how much we've paid in since April 2018, because that's quite a lot of money.
Jonathan?
We say sustainable funding for public transport and we will do the rest.
Brilliant. Sorry.
Certainly agree with the funding for transport. I'd also encourage them to look at our welfare benefit system. We need to think about the individual financial situation of people living in transport poverty, and we need to ensure that the benefit and welfare system is fair and is easy to access and is sufficient to meet the extra costs that people are living with.
Thanks very much. Well, I hope you'll agree. If you're as enthusiastic about the topic, which I think is very important, we're really glad to continue this discussion. Some really thoughtful contributions from our panel. So thanks to the panel for your time. Thanks for you who joined us for the discussion. Do please keep in touch with us, and I hope to see you all again soon.